Yes. Mm-hmm. Very good, brother. Mm-hmm. Brother Don mentions the fact that In Search of God's Way recently had a lesson, probably a series of lessons on human suffering, and that you can get that booklet if you like to. Go to the internet and you say, In Search of God's Way? Lord's Way, In Search of the Lord's Way, okay? And you can get that, and it would be good for you to get a hold of that material. Hopefully, you can do that and read it, and it will add to what we're talking about in this series. Last week, we were talking about some specific ways in which people suffer physically. We talked about sickness, and we talked about death. And we talked a good deal about death, and I don't think we need to add to that tonight, but I wanted to say sometimes it's good for us to keep a good sense of humor, even in regard to death. I was reading a little article that was written in the Heart to Heart and House to House. I never know which way you say that thing, but Alan Webster had a little story in there about a lady who was elderly, and she had never married. And she died and had written out some instructions for her funeral. In her instructions, it had to do with the fact that she'd never married. Now, some people call a person like that an old maid. I prefer to call them an unclaimed blessing, personally. And that lady, who was an unclaimed blessing, wrote out instructions for her funeral, and she said she didn't want any men to serve as pallbearers in her funeral. And she said, they didn't take me out when I was alive, and I don't want them to take me out after I'm dead. There's some thought in that. I read somewhere years ago about a man up in Minnesota, I believe, who had died. His name was Pease. He spelled it P-E-A-S-E. And when he was buried, they put this inscription on his tombstone: "This ain't peas, it's only a pod. The pea's been shelled and gone to God." Now that's a pretty quaint way to do it and say it, but that's about the truth, you see. That which is the real person is inside this body, and the outward body is simply the house in which he lives. And so this ain't peas, it's only a pod. Pea's been shelled and gone to God. Tonight, I'd like for us to think a little bit about aging, growing old. Now, I realize that I'm much too young to deal adequately with this subject. I understand that. And I must admit that I'm not looking forward to growing old. I guess that'll come one day, but I'm not really looking forward to it. I really don't like to tell people how old I am. I'm like some people I've known who don't like to admit how old they are, and I really don't care for it. One man asked me, "How old are you?" I said, "Can you keep a secret?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I can too." I was kidding with him, of course, and sometimes people ask me how old I am, and I say, "Well, I must admit that I'm not as young as I look." And they know I'm being facetious with that as well. But I don't like the idea of getting old, but I don't want to die. I want to go ahead and live. But most of us are that way. We don't want to die, and yet at the same time we don't want to be old. But as I look in the mirror, I see that my hair is turning gray prematurely. When I comb my hair, I'll stand with my back to the big mirror, with a little mirror, so I can see the back of my head and cover up those places where the hair is a little sparse. I used to do it right over here, but recently I noticed there's another place on this other side that's a little sparse. And so my hair is not only turning gray, but some of it is turning loose. And these may be indications that I am getting older. We don't like that idea, do we? But when this nation was founded, a person who was born could expect to live to be about 35 years of age. Now you think about that. The average lifespan then was about 35. Now you can expect to live about 77 or 78 years if you're born in our day. Now, some people think that growing old is a curse, but it is better than the alternative. They can say what they want to about being over the hill, but it's better than being under the hill, I can tell you that. Now, it may be that you are wondering if you are reaching that stage in life. Let me read a few things that might indicate to you whether you're getting old or not. Everything hurts, and what doesn't hurt doesn't work. You feel like the night before and you haven't been anywhere. Your little black book contains only names ending in MD. You get winded playing chess. Your children begin to look middle-aged. You look forward to a dull evening. You sit in a rocking chair and you can't get it going. Your knees buckle and your belt won't. You're 17 around the neck and 42 around the waist. You stop looking forward to your next birthday. Dialing long distance wears you out. You sink your teeth into a steak and they stay there. You know, having false teeth used to be one of the big indications that you're getting older. You don't really find many people today who have false teeth. There are some, you know, most of them are older people. But I remember hearing about a man who was talking with his friend one day. He said, last night was cold. I just shivered all night long. And his friend said, well, did your teeth chatter? He said, I don't know. We don't sleep together. That's one of the indications in the past that you were getting old. But that's not necessarily true in our day. Well, I might say that I'm not old, but I've reached the point that it takes longer to rest than it does to get tired. And maybe you can identify with that. What does the Bible say about getting old? Well, you are impressed with the fact in the Old Testament that age is honored. Age is respected. In Proverbs chapter 16, verse 31, the Bible has something to say about that. 16:31, the hoary head is a crown of glory, if it be found in the way of righteousness. The hoary head, that refers to gray hair, hair that's changing in colors. Then in chapter 20, verse 29, the glory of the young men is their strength, and the beauty of old men is the gray head. I think we've departed from this honor that's given to older people. Now we want to put older people on the shelf, and we glorify being young. Now, what does Paul teach about aging, growing old? Well, he teaches that we don't need to feel obsolete. When something becomes obsolete, you set it aside. Put it down in the basement or up in the attic somewhere. How long has it been since you have seen a phone booth or a paid telephone? Those things have become obsolete, and we've set them aside. There are people who think that older people need to be set aside. They become obsolete. But Paul said in Philippians 3, verses 13 and 14, brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things that are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Paul was not looking to the past, he's looking to the future. He's not ready to be put up on the shelf and forgotten. He's not becoming obsolete. He's still looking to the future, looking toward heaven. And that's the way all of us need to look at it. We don't get so old that we need to be put on the shelf somewhere and become obsolete. Paul reminds us also that we never have to peak spiritually. Now, physically, you're going to peak. You're going to rise until a certain time, and then you level off, and then you start going in the other direction. Those of us who are a little older understand that. I used to play softball until I was in my 60s, but I don't do it anymore. There are some things that I can't do that I used to do, and you're the same way. But you know, you can begin to decline physically, but you don't have to decline spiritually. In reality, you can keep on going spiritually until you die. You do not have to reach a peak spiritually. And so we need to place the proper emphasis upon the inner man, the spiritual man. Now, we're very concerned about the outward man, and Americans spend millions of dollars, billions of dollars really, at the cosmetic counters in an effort to restore the rose of adolescence that has long since passed away. You know, we pay a lot of money for these things we fill up the wrinkles with, you see, to smooth out everything. We spend a lot of money on the outward man. Now, that's all right, but we need to place greater emphasis upon the inward man and do the things that will enable the soul, the inner man, to keep on going uphill. It does not need to reach a plateau and begin to go downhill. Your physical body will, but spiritually, you can keep on going uphill. Life's greatest tragedy is not the wasting away of the outer man, but it is the unnecessary death of the inner man. That's the tragedy. When we become so concerned about the outer man that we neglect the inner man, and it can begin to die if we don't pay attention to it. In 1 Timothy 4, verse 8, Paul said, "For bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things, having promise of the life that now is, and of that which is to come." And so godliness is paying attention to the inner man, becoming godly inwardly. And that'll have something to do with your life now and the life to come. Having promise of the life that now is, and of that which is to come. He said, bodily exercise profiteth little. It profits us physically, but that doesn't have much to do with the life to come. We need to be more concerned about the inward man and building it so it will keep on growing until death. Finally, Paul affirms that for each of us the best is yet to be. Was it Robert Browning who said, "Grow old along with me"? The best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first was made. And so we're looking forward to the best in the future. And all of this life is preparation for that time. We need to be concerned about our bodies, obviously, but we need to be greatly concerned about our souls. Be godly people, so we can be blessed in this life and in the life that is to come. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. To die is gain. If you are a faithful Christian, as Paul was, and you die, that's not a loss. It is a gain. In verse 23, he said, "For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you." For Paul to die and go to be with Christ was the best thing for him. But for other people to be taught by Paul that they might have that hope is a necessity. Paul wanted to stay here and try to help people go to heaven. And so we need to realize that getting old is not the worst thing. We need to be using all the time that we have, even when we get old, to pay careful attention to that inner man and not let it reach a peak and start in the other direction. Aging is one way in which some people suffer. And then there are accidents. I mentioned the fact that I had a friend who was up on a ladder doing some work at his house and fell off, hit his head on concrete, and died. There are things that happen like that. I was preaching in a large city, and there were a number of congregations and preachers in town, and one of my fellow preachers there had a son who was injured playing football. He was paralyzed playing football, and he was paralyzed until he died 25 years later. Think of the suffering that that young man had to endure, and think of the suffering of his parents. They had to take care of him as they would take care of a little day-old baby. And so accidents can come. We need to be careful, of course, in what we do. We need to drive carefully and safely. We need to watch carefully in everything so we won't fall and we won't have a wreck or won't get hurt in some other way. But when accidents come, we need to just follow good wisdom, common sense, and do the right things in regard to our health and pray that God will bless us. But accidents will come. And then there are persecutions. We've mentioned this, but Paul said in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 12, "Yea, and all that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution." Now, we haven't been made to suffer as those people in those days. Not long after the church began, God's people began to suffer at the hands of the Jews and at the hand of Saul, the greatest persecutor of all. We read in Acts 8 and verse 4, "Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word." The persecutions brought upon God's people helped spread the gospel because they were sent everywhere away from the persecution there. So persecution sometimes can be helpful to us. The book of Revelation was written to encourage God's people under persecution. They would be persecuted unmercifully by the Roman Empire. And if you're wondering what the book of Revelation means, you can write these two words at the end of the book and you'll have it. We won. God's people won, and they will win, even though they're persecuted. In Revelation 2 and verse 10, the writer says, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." So if we are faithful, even in persecution, we will receive a reward, a crown of life. And so persecution can be one of the ways in which God's people suffer. And then there is another way, and I had really overlooked this as I was preparing this series. I had read about 20 books and magazines and whatever on this subject, and I had made a lot of notes as if I were going to write a dissertation. I had about 25 pages of typed notes, and then I kept reading more. And then somewhere along the line, I realized that I had left out one way in which people suffer, and that is by poverty. And I wondered how in the world I overlooked that. One reason is the fact that those books that I had read had not even mentioned it as one of the ways in which people suffer. And that is an amazing thing. I kept on reading about 40 more books, magazines, and whatever. And finally, I found 3 books, and the last ones I read, that talked about suffering in the realm of poverty. Now, that's an amazing thing. I'm surprised because I have been raised in poverty. I should have known it, but didn't think about it, even though I had been raised in poverty. I can identify with the poor. My dad had 8 kids. That's better than having too many, I guess, but he had 8 and had 10 mouths to feed. He was a drunkard and smoked heavily. And after he bought his alcohol and tobacco, there wasn't much left for his family to eat on. We were raised in poverty. I jokingly sometimes tell people we were so poor that we had to eat dried apples for breakfast, drink hot water for lunch, and then swell up for supper. Well, that's not entirely true, but I understand what poverty is, and I understand what hunger is. I remember going out and looking for an egg in the yard. We had a neighbor that had chickens, and they used our land, where we were living at least, as their chicken yard. And I went out looking to see if they might have laid an egg in our yard so I could have that to eat. I understand what it means to be in poverty and to be poor. We lived in an old unpainted shack. You've been out in the country driving along and you've seen an old shack with vines growing up all over it. People have abandoned it. It was unpainted. That's the kind of house I lived in when I was young. It must have been built around the beginning of the last century. We didn't have any running water in our house. And our bathroom was about 50 feet from the house. You understand that's what we called an outhouse, for those of you who are young and who didn't live back then. Our outhouse was about 50 feet from the house. I say we didn't have any running water in the house. When I was young, we had to take a bath in a number 3 wash tub. Do you remember that number 3 wash tub? I imagine after 8 kids had their bath in that wash tub, it looked like topsoil when we all got through with that, you know. But I made me a shower. We had a little mulberry tree right next to the house, and I climbed up in the tree with a water hose, and I hung that water hose between 2 limbs like that, and turned the water on, got out there in my bathing suit, and that was my shower. Had running water outside the house, but not inside the house. So we understand the poverty that some people experience and have to go through. I'm sure some of you could tell about your life and the way you lived when you were young. One person said, there were 13 kids in my family, and we were so poor, we had to eat cereal with a fork so we can save the milk for the next kid on down the line, you see. Had to share the milk with all the kids. That might be a little exaggeration, I don't know. But I understand this. I worked my way through school from the 6th grade right on through college without a dime from my parents. And so I understand what some people have to go through in poverty. I went to the Christian Home and Bible School at Mount Dora. I was not in the home, though almost was. Someone here thought I'd been in the home there at Mount Dora, but I really wasn't in it officially. But I remember hearing my parents talk to an aunt and uncle about placing us in the home at Mount Dora, though that didn't come to pass. But I spent about as much time over there on the campus as they did. I stayed one summer on the campus and helped build a dormitory on the campus. And so we spent a lot of time there, and I understand what orphans have to go through. I've seen it firsthand there at Mount Dora. I heard about somebody who said, I used to have to wear hand-me-down clothes. And somebody said, what's wrong with that? He said, I had 2 older sisters. Now, I had to wear hand-me-down clothes too, and I had 2 sisters, but fortunately they were younger than I was. Many people suffer in poverty, but poverty today is not like poverty was back when I was young and when some of you were young. Today, you have Medicare, welfare programs, SSI in certain cases, food stamps. People today can live like kings nearly compared to what they used to have to live because of all these helps that they have today. But I've seen poverty. I've seen poverty here, and I've seen it in Russia and Ukraine. I've seen people eating out of a garbage can. My translator and I, one time, were traveling across Ukraine, and we'd ridden on a train all night. And when we got off the train there at Kiev, there was a McDonald's out in front of us. So we went there and ate a bite and came outside to catch a bus. We were in a hurry to get somewhere. And I saw a lady, an old lady, come to a garbage can, and she was scrounging around in that garbage can, and she found a part of a hamburger that someone had not finished. She picked it up and ate it. And then she picked up a cup that had some liquid in it. It must have been melted ice, but usually they didn't have ice over there. It might have just been warm Coke, and she drank out of the same straw that someone had been using. And I feel badly to this day. My conscience bothers me until this day because I did not go and take her inside and buy her some food to eat. We were in a big hurry, and I didn't even think of doing it, but I'm ashamed of it. But I've seen people like that who are really hungry. I saw a man scrounging around in the garbage behind the apartments where we were and where we held services. And I saw him pick up an ear of corn. He must have had some corn left on it, so he just stood there and ate it right there. He just picked it up out of the garbage and ate it. There are people like that in the world who are hungry. Now, I don't personally know anyone who is really in poverty right now. I used to know some, but I don't know anybody right now. Most people today have something to eat. Many people are hungry, and there are various reasons for it. Many people are hungry because of what someone else did not do. Jesus said in Matthew 12 and verse 8, "The poor you have with you always, but me you have not." There will always be poor people, and there are many reasons for it, as I suggested. Many children are suffering because of sins of the parents. When I was preaching at Dalrata here in town, we had a food program, and we had someone over it, and if somebody came to the building needing food, he'd bag up groceries and give to them. And one day a young lady came to the office and told the secretary that she wanted to talk to the pastor. Of course, I was not a pastor, and my secretary knew that, but she knew that denominational people use the term pastor to refer to the preacher. She knew she wanted to talk to me, so she came in and talked with me. Now I want you to notice the things involved in this. She had 3 kids. She was 17 years old. She had never been married, and each child was by a different man. So you see the kind of life she was living. Those children were innocent. They were not responsible for that, but they were hungry. They were in need. Sometimes children suffer because of the sins of the parents. Some are in poverty because they won't work. And Paul has something to say about that. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, he said, "If any will not work, neither let him eat." God's plan is for people to work, and they need to be taught to work. Ephesians 4:28 teaches the same thing. Some are poor because of circumstances beyond their control. There are people who are poor, and it's just beyond their control. And we should not look down upon them if they're poor, when that's the best they can do. Some people maybe didn't get very much education, so they couldn't get a job that would pay enough to take care of the family. And then sometimes the husband's job is moved overseas, and he's at an age at which he can't just go out and start over and get a good job. And so they may be very poor because of the circumstances beyond their control. There are people like that who are poor, and they suffer because of poverty. And if you've never been in poverty, you may not understand that. But sometimes people are in poverty and really suffer as a result of it. Now, what does the Bible say about this matter of having something to eat and the things we need? In Matthew 6:33, Jesus said, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Now, the Lord promises to take care of us and provide for us. And we need to, of course, depend upon God to do that when we do our part. We need to depend upon God to help us when we do our part. We have no promise that we can just pray, "God, send me some food," and then sit down and do nothing. We have to do what we can do. And Paul teaches that we need to learn the lesson of contentment. In Philippians 4:11, he said, "I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therein to be content." Now that has an application here. If we are poor and we're doing the best we can, if we've done everything we can do, we need to be content with what we have. Now, we're going to have something to eat, no doubt. We'll have some things. We may not drive the car that somebody else is driving. We may not live in the kind of house someone else has. But in all probability, we can live. And we need to be content with what we have. With what? In 1 Timothy 6:8, Paul said, "And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content." Food and raiment. That's not very much, is it? But those are the real necessities of life. We need to be content with what we have. Contentment is a good lesson for all of us to learn. Now, which one would be the most contented? A person who has 12 kids or a person who has $12 million? Which one do you think would be the most contented? You have a tendency to think it'd be the man with $12 million. But he's not contented. He wants more no matter what he has. It's the person who has 12 kids who's contented because he doesn't want any more. That's the lesson we need to learn. We need to be content with what we have when we've done the best we can do. Poverty and wealth can have their dangers. We've been thinking about poverty, but wealth can have their temptations and dangers as well. In Proverbs 30, verse 8, Solomon said, "Give me neither poverty nor riches." And in the context, he says, if I am in poverty, then I may become angry and bitter against God because of my circumstances. That's a possibility. So poverty can bring temptations. On the other hand, wealth can bring temptations as well. If a person is wealthy, he may forget about God. He may assume that he doesn't need God. He doesn't need his help. He may go on through life trying to take care of himself and forget all about God. And so there are dangers in both directions, in poverty and wealth. But we need to realize that these things are for this life. And we don't have to have a lot of this world's goods in order to prepare to go to heaven. And when we leave, we're going to leave these possessions behind because they're only for this life. When I was preaching for the church at Del Rita, I conducted approximately 100 funerals. 100 funerals. If you don't believe that, come by my house. I've got the list of them. You can count them. One congregation, 100 funerals. Many times I've been out to the silent city of the dead, going with that hearse to lay someone to rest. But I have never seen a U-Haul trailer attached to the back of one of those hearses. Never seen a U-Haul trailer attached to one. When they die, they leave all those possessions behind. They really don't have a great deal to do with the life to come. Of course, we have to use what we have properly. We can lay up treasures in heaven by doing God's will. We all understand that. But we're going to leave these possessions behind. Jesus teaches that we need to worry about serving Him, putting Him first in our lives. I say worry. That's not the best use of that word there. We need to be concerned about serving God, putting Him first in our lives, and then we can have what we'll eat, drink, and wear. Have what we need. In Matthew 6, verse 25, in that context in which Jesus has been talking about what we'll eat or drink or wear, in verse 25 He said, "Take therefore no thought what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air. They sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they?" God promises to bless us and take care of us if we serve Him and put Him first in our lives. In Psalm 37, verse 25, David said, "I have been young, and now am old. Yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread." And so the Lord teaches that He's going to take care of us if we put Him first in our lives. He doesn't promise that it's going to be T-bone steaks at Longhorn Steakhouse. It may be beans and rice from Walmart. We don't have a promise that we're going to have the best things to eat. But He promises to take care of us. You may be able to say this too, but I don't remember ever eating a steak when I was young. And now and then we had some of those tube steaks. Tube steaks, wieners. A lot of rice and beans. But you see, I've caught up since I've been an adult. I made it all right, and I've caught up and gone beyond. And so the Bible teaches that there will be people who are in poverty, and people can suffer that way. And if we're Christians, we'll want to be aware of that and watch for opportunities to help people who are really in need. And so we realize there are various ways in which we can suffer in this life: death, aging, accidents, persecution, and poverty. Now, our time is almost up, but let me just go ahead and begin the next section. We've been talking about how we can suffer physically. Now I'd like for us to think about how we can suffer mentally and emotionally. There are a lot of people who are suffering mentally and emotionally. And one of the ways in which we can suffer in that way is through worry. Hurry, bury, and worry are three words that describe our generation. Hurry, worry, and bury. We worry about a lot of things. We worry about what people think of us. We worry about things that may happen to us. We worry about our illnesses. We worry about our families. There are many things about which we worry. And I would not be entirely truthful if I said, I never worry. I imagine all of us can say at times we worry. But we need to think about that and what it will do to us and what the Bible says about it. How do we overcome worry? What do we do about it? Well, first analyze it. Look at this worry business and see why you're worrying. Determine what can be done. And then don't worry about something that you can help. If you can help it, do it. Don't worry about it, do it. Second, don't worry about the things you can't help. If it can't be changed, there's no need to worry about it. Now, I know that's a lot easier to say than do, but it's something we need to work on. And I believe as our faith in God grows and our dependence upon Him grows, then we'll worry less and less. Number two, pray about it. In Philippians 4, verses 6 and 7, Paul said, be careful for nothing. That's the King James Version. The American Standard Version says, in nothing be anxious. In our language today, we'd say don't worry about anything. Some young people today would say don't sweat it. Don't worry about anything. Pray about it. In everything. There is nothing that lies beyond the realm of prayer that lies within the will of God. If it's within God's will, we can pray about it. And what will be the result? In verse 7, Paul says, and the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Peace will come when we depend upon God. Pray about the matter. Now, peace will be the opposite of worry. We have peace, we don't have worry. And then number 3, take appropriate action. Action is the third word. Take appropriate action. Whatever you need to do, do it. And then you'll be able to conquer it. We have a little more we want to say about that. And we'll take up there next week. Good to have you with us tonight.